afternoon to our friends in Europe and South Asia, and good evening to our friends in East Asia. Ladies and gentlemen, today the Center for Aerospace and Security Studies is hosting an international webinar on an important topic of Sino-India border clashes, implications for South Asian strategic environment. It's an important topic which has received significant world attention, but the focus has largely been on the tactical, regional, and immediate implications. Therefore, CAS felt the need to organize a timely webinar today to look at its strategic implications in all its manifestations regarding the foreign defense policy, security environment, doctrines, postures of global and regional players who have an interest and stake in this very important region. More recently, the US elections have also added another interesting dimensions to this environment, and we look forward to our illustrious panel to analyze its various aspects and facets. But before I introduce our very illustrious panel today, for the benefit of those who are joining us today for the first time, I'd like to briefly share what CAS is and what we do. Ladies and gentlemen, the Center for Aerospace and Security Studies is an independent think tank based in Islamabad. It is a unique think tank because we have a distinction of being the only think tank of Pakistan which specializes in the aerospace sector. And you are all aware that it is a key driver of globalization and all its different domains, whether it's socioeconomic, politics, security, and international security. So CAS provides comprehensive insight, analysis, policy input by engaging with leading strategic thinkers, policy analysts, practitioners, and academics for timely, informed, and substantive discourse of international and regional issues. So without any further ado, I'd like to have the honor of introducing the illustrious panel. But before that, allow me the privilege of introducing the chair of today's webinar, the president of CAS, and former Chief of Air Staff, Air Chief Marshal Kaleem Saadat. Air Chief Marshal Kaleem Saadat has rendered 38 years long service to Pakistan Air Force in different operational, command, and staff appointments. He has a master's degree in defense and strategic studies and is also a graduate of ESGI and CSI, some of the leading military institutions in France. He was the member of directing staff at Air War College, Pakistan Air Force, and also the chief instructor of National Defense Wing of the then National Defense College, which is now called the National Defense University. He's now the patron-in-chief of Thinkers Forum Pakistan, of which he has been a president and contributing writer for 6 years. He has been the patron of Pakistan Ex-Servicemen Association as well. And that brings me to the brief introduction for the benefit of our worldwide audience of our prolific speakers. The first speaker today will be Mr. Rahul Roy Chaudhary, who basically does not need any introduction, but definitely deserves one. He's a senior fellow for South Asia at the International Institute of Strategic Studies, London. He is an expert on India's security, foreign and defense policies and politics. He leads the South Asia Research Program of the International Institute of Strategic Studies, London. His research has focused on Pakistan, Afghanistan, and regional security. He gives select policy relevant talks and briefings and organizes track 1.5 meetings. He lectures at the Oxford University, has worked as a senior research fellow at the International Policy Institute, King's College, London. He has also earlier served in the National Security Council Secretariat in the Prime Minister's Office, India, and also worked at the Institute for Defense Studies in New Delhi. Our second speaker today will be Dr. Tong Zhao, who is a senior fellow in the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, based at the Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy in Beijing. His research focuses on strategic and security issues, including nuclear weapons policy, deterrence, arms control, non-proliferation, missile defense, hypersonic weapons, and regional and nuclear crises. He's on the board of directors of the Asia Pacific Leadership Network for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, and associate editor of the Journal of Science and Global Security, and a member of the prestigious International Panel on Fissile Material. He was previously part of the Managing the Atoms Program and the International Security Program at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard University. He has held a number of other positions, including a fellowship at CSIS, and has also worked for the Office of Foreign Affairs of the People's Government of Beijing Municipality. He holds a PhD in Science Technology, a BS in Physics, and an MA in International Relations. Our third speaker today will be Mr. Michael Kugelman. Mr. Michael Kugelman is the Deputy Director of the Asia Program and Senior Associate for South Asia at the Woodrow Wilson Center, where he's responsible for the research, programming, and publications on the region. He specializes in Pakistan, India, and Afghanistan, and the US relations with each of them. He has extensively published policy briefs, journal articles, and book chapters on this region, and he received his MA in Law and Diplomacy from the Fletcher School at Tufts University. Our fourth and last speaker today will be Lieutenant General Ishfaq Nadeem Ahmed. He's a former Chief of General Staff of Pakistan Army. Earlier, he has commanded a strike corps of Pakistan Army and also served as the Director General of Military Operations, called DGMO. And he has also earlier served as Chief of Staff of one corps. He was responsible for the planning of Pakistan Army's famous Operation Zarb-e-Azb during his tenure as DGMO. He has commanded a strike infantry division and also led successful military operation in Swat. He was awarded Hilal Imtiaz Military in August 2011. So, ladies and gentlemen, without any further ado, I'd like to invite the first speaker today, Mr. Rahul Roy Chaudhary, to deliberate upon the impact of Sino-India border clashes on South Asian strategic environment. And we will also like to hear from him how he views that the Sino-India border clashes, how they will affect India's global and regional policies. So, Mr. Chaudhary, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Syed Mohammed Ali, for the kind invitation to speak at this important webinar, and equally important to be among such an illustrious group of panelists. I have about 12 to 15 minutes, so let me quickly begin and say that I want to focus my remarks on India's perspective towards China in South Asia and the Indian Ocean, the Indo-Pacific, and make 4 fundamental points. First point will be that the recent violent border clashes between Indian and Chinese troops have, I believe, resulted in a deterioration of bilateral relations between the two countries that cannot be easily or quickly reversed. My second point is that as a result of this, India's existing competition with China in South Asia and the broader Indian Ocean region is likely to sharpen into what I would describe as possible contestation on defense and security ties between India and China with neighboring and Indian Ocean states. And thirdly, that India's participation in the Quad group of countries, which I'll explain later, will likely increase, but its focus will be broader than just defense and security alone. And my final point is that a potential defense and security focused regional policy is not risk-free for India. It therefore needs to be imaginative and sensitively applied by New Delhi if it is to result in political diplomatic dividends for South Bloc. Let me take the first point and look at the India-China clash that took place recently. Essentially, this was the clash on the line of actual control in the Galwan Valley in eastern Ladakh, the worst of which took place 5 months ago on the 15th of June, in which 20 Indian soldiers and an officially unacknowledged number of Chinese soldiers were killed. Many of you may perhaps wonder why this event on the India-China border has been given so much prominence by India and become so significant for India's foreign policy when there have been many more casualties on the line of control between India and Pakistan. The reason is that despite occasional border clashes, some violent between Indian and Chinese soldiers on the LAC, none of these clashes had till then led to the loss of lives. This was the first time in 45 years that Indian soldiers had died on the Sino-Indian border, and hence the significance and impact of this clash. In effect, this also represented a robust policy by India's Modi government to confront Chinese troops physically and assert India's physical presence over disputed territorial areas. It also represents, I believe, a fundamental change in India's perception of China. In the past, the cooperative elements of trade and commercial links had been satisfactorily compartmentalized alongside the competitive elements of the India-China relationship. But I believe this is no longer likely to be the case, with competitive border, foreign policy, and security issues gaining priority. This is not to imply that the cooperative elements of the relationship, both bilaterally and multilaterally, including China being India's largest trade partner, are expected to be disrupted, but that they are likely to have lesser priority in the Modi government's decision-making process vis-à-vis China. Notably, India's punitive response for the Galwan Valley clash included political and diplomatic measures, including the banning of social media apps, the stalling of select Chinese investment and infrastructure projects in India, and the reported removal of Chinese technology company Huawei from India's 5G competition. Let me now apply this change in relationship to what I have called India's new primacy of competitive bilateral relations with China to the regions of South Asia and the Indian Ocean. And this brings me to my second point. The single exception to this clearly is Pakistan, where this does not apply because of Pakistan's strong relations with China and its heightened tensions with India. In effect, my sense is that India's existing competition with China in both these regions of South Asia and the Indian Ocean is likely to sharpen considerably. India, as you know, was the first major country to formally oppose China's Belt and Road Initiative, and it refused to officially attend both BRI forums held so far in China. India's public objection to BRI focuses on its flagship project, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. The Indian government perceives the CPEC projects, CPEC projects in Gilgit-Baltistan and Pakistan-administered Jammu and Kashmir as a violation of Indian sovereignty, as New Delhi claims this region as part of its own Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh Union territories. Clearly, this perspective is not shared and is challenged by Pakistan. At the same time, India's security community remains concerned over the strategic impact of BRI, especially on China's expanding role and influence in South Asia and the Indian Ocean regions. And this perspective is now widely shared by a number of countries, including the US. China's presence and influence in the Indian Ocean has resulted in the establishment of its first overseas military base in Djibouti of the Horn of Africa 3 years ago, multiple warship visits and deployments in the area, including for anti-piracy patrols, the supply of 2 submarines to Bangladesh, the first joint military exercise with Nepal, and 2 visits by Chinese submarine to Sri Lanka in 2014. To counter China's influence, India has sought to deepen maritime security and defense cooperation in the Indian Ocean, where it clearly has considerable advantage at the moment vis-a-vis China. This includes defense logistics sharing pacts with several countries, including the US, France, Australia, and Singapore in the Indian Ocean, and with others in the broader Indo-Pacific region. The activation of first-time defense-related lines of credit by India to Bangladesh, Mauritius, and Seychelles, and potentially to Sri Lanka, and the completion of maritime surveillance projects in Sri Lanka, Mauritius, and the Seychelles, and most recently, the agreement to supply an ex-Indian Navy submarine to Myanmar. India will also likely seek the reactivation of its trilateral maritime security cooperation initiative with the Maldives and Sri Lanka, which has been lying dormant for the past 6 years, along with its long-planned expansion with the inclusion of Mauritius and Seychelles as full members of this trilateral group. And the recent defense and security agreements we've seen between the Maldives and the US not only symbolizes the growing convergence with India in the Indian Ocean for the US, but also builds on the India-US defense cooperation that we most recently saw in terms of the signing of the India-US Basic Exchange and Cooperation Agreement for Geospatial Intelligence, signed last month in Delhi. The new US Biden presidency is likely to continue its defense and security focus and arms sales to India, although there may be several irritants along the way, but we shall wait and see. And this brings me neatly to my third point on India and the Quad group of countries, essentially the US, Japan, and Australia. Very often the Quad and the Malabar series of naval exercises are mixed up. For India, the Quad is a group of like-minded countries that see the Indo-Pacific as a free and open region that supports the rules-based international system. And yes, a political focus on China is very much the case for the Quad. But the Malabar series of exercises are quite different. They began as a bilateral annual exercise between India and the US that has expanded to include Japan and most recently Australia. But the Malabar exercises are not the defense or navy pact of the Quad countries, far from it. A key indicator is that while there have been multiple Quad foreign ministerial and senior official meetings, there has not been a single Quad meeting of defense ministries. If this changes and we have a Quad meeting led by defense ministry senior officials or defense ministers, it will then be a significant development. In effect, India's participation in the Quad group of countries will likely increase, but its focus, I believe, will be broader than just defense and security. And now my final point, and that is that India's possible contestation that I've described with China on defense and security issues in South Asia and the Indian Ocean does not come risk-free for India. This will lead to critical rhetoric and likely other putative responses from China. India's leverage with its immediate neighbors, with the exception of Pakistan, will also continue to be hampered by the neighborhood priorities of its domestic politics. In May 2020, for example, Nepal's new map showed for the first time areas of dispute with India. At the same time, India needs to be sensitive to the concerns of regional states, especially when they strive to balance their security links with India and their trade and credit ties with China, especially during the ongoing challenging COVID-dominant economic environment. In August 2020, for example, Sri Lanka stated it would keep its India first approach on security matters, but would pursue a neutral foreign policy. In essence, and my concluding thought is, in essence, when India seeks diplomatic dividends for a heightened security-led initiative in the region in relation to China, it will need to be imaginative in policy formulation, ensure project implementation, and most important of all, be sensitive to the interests and concerns of its smaller neighbors. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chaudhary, for a very comprehensive, rich, and insightful perspective of how India sees this very important issue of Sino-India border clashes. And you have aptly explained its strategic implications for not just this region, but also in terms of its influence over Indian threat perception, the regional strategic trends, and also perhaps a review of Sino-India relations in terms of its implications for the nature and size of economic relationship. And your talk has set the stage and perhaps raised the most important and relevant points for Mr. Tong Zhao to address because he's expected to share his perspective that how Chinese defense and foreign policy is likely to be affected by these border clashes and how they see India in future. Is it a concern? Is it an opportunity? Or will there be a fresh look after these clashes? So, Mr. Zhao, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much. My personal research focuses very much on nuclear policy issues. So in my short presentation, I will first offer a few general observations about the China-India border conflict and its regional implications, and then also discuss the impact on the China-India nuclear relationship and other broader regional security issues. So firstly, on the border clash, I think there is a serious perception gap between the two sides. From the Chinese perspective, India has been trying to change the status quo across the border region. And the Chinese perception was very much affected by two events. One is in August when India revoked the special status of Jammu and Kashmir and turned it into two union territories that are going to be directly governed by the federal government of India. And second was the public statement by the Indian Home Minister who said in the parliament last year that Aksai Chin is an integral and inseparable part of Jammu and Kashmir. I think those events were triggered Chinese concern that the India side from the central government level is trying to change the status quo regarding the disputed territory. And in addition to that, India has been building roads and better infrastructure near the border region. And the traditional Chinese view has been that the Indian side is using the salami slicing tactic to gradually and step by step encroach on the disputed territory. With that perception, now the thinking in Beijing is China has become more powerful. China has greater capability. So China should make better use of its growing material power to push back against the perceived Indian aggression. In addition to that, the Chinese top political leadership has personally called for Chinese party members and officials to adopt the so-called fighting spirit, which makes the Chinese military officials feel the pressure, I believe, to implement the fighting spirit, which means the military also needs to show their resolve in defending Chinese national security. In contrast, the Indian perspective was very different. The Indians also believe China is changing the status quo across the border region. The Union territory decision was purely a domestic decision. The Home Minister's statement was simply his personal view. There was no coordination between him and the federal government. And although India has been advancing and improving infrastructure across the border region, China has been building more roads on its side of the border. And earlier this year, the Chinese conducted a major military exercise that later led to the deployment of more Chinese troops to the border region. You can see there is a clear perception gap between the two sides, and it is totally possible, I think. Both sides genuinely believe that their policy is purely self-defensive. However, I think the current confrontation between the two sides, despite their self-perceived defensive purposes, is not going to end anytime soon. For some time, China used to focus on diplomatic efforts to resolve the border dispute with India. China was willing to work with India to clarify the location of the line of actual control. But the Chinese conclusion drawn from such exercises was that the Indian side is not acting in good faith. India tried to abuse this joint effort by defining as much territory as possible as disputed. So the observation drawn by the Chinese side was there is no way that the China could work with India in this manner to resolve the border dispute. So ultimately, the exact location of the border would be decided by push and shove on the ground. So I think there is a growing dismissive attitude in Beijing about resolving the border dispute purely through diplomatic manner. And I think this recent clash in Galwan Valley and other places along the border has proven to the Chinese that that what they think is right and is going to happen. Which means as long as both countries continue their current approach on the disputed territory issue, their confrontation is going to be a long-term phenomenon. And there are various domestic factors in China that also make China less likely to compromise on this issue anytime soon. The Chinese domestic decision-making system is becoming more centralized in recent years around a Chinese president. And the Chinese president has a very strong personal view on territorial issue. He has said very explicitly that China should fight and should never give up any inch of its territory, which means both Chinese foreign policy officials and military officials, they would face huge costs, political costs and career costs if they appear to concede in the border dispute. And the Chinese media has also promoted the narrative that the Chinese side is purely self-defensive and India is the aggressor, which makes the general public in China also unlikely to accept any concession by the Chinese government on this issue. And many Chinese experts, they genuinely believe that India was deliberately picking trouble with China for at least 3 reasons. One is maybe India was really troubled by domestic situations, including the large numbers of COVID infection cases. Indian politicians wanted to shift attention away to external issues. And second, they think that India believed that China was vulnerable because of the origin of the COVID-19 and the international accusation against China. So it was a good time for India to make a move. And third, there's this belief that India's aggressive move was encouraged by the United States. So such perception strengthens the Chinese view that China needs to push back firmly against the perceived Indian aggression and to set the right precedent for other countries. There is a Chinese saying that to kill to kill a chicken to scare the monkeys. So the Chinese view is China needs to stand firmly on the disputed territorial issue with India so that it can send a strong message to other mid powers in Chinese neighborhood so that they won't exploit Chinese vulnerabilities in the future and they won't work with the United States to hurt Chinese interests. Strategically, I think doing so is not necessarily in Chinese national interests. I think it's not a good time to drive the India-China bilateral relationship into a bad situation over a disputed territory in very remote regions. And worsening the bilateral relationship is only going to push India closer to the American orbit at a time when China really needs political support from India on other international affairs. The confrontation with India also added to China's multiple front confrontations with many other countries, Japan, Australia, US, Canada, and other European countries. So it really put China in a very difficult position. I think there is a recognition of such risks within the Chinese policy community. And therefore, China has tried to dial down the tensions. China conducted a number of diplomatic meetings with the Indian counterparts. There were a series of core commander level meetings on the border. But fundamentally, I think the Chinese thinking is this is a fight that was picked by India, and China has no choice but to stand the ground. Therefore, the military preparations along the border continue, and they are likely to continue into the winter. I think to some extent, China is determined to accept necessary costs. And politically, China does not feel too concerned about the China-India bilateral relationship. China feels very confident about the power gap between the two countries. The thinking is because of China's military superiority in this region, India won't be able to make any gain on the ground near the border. China has better logistical support, better military equipment. China even has better technology in building barracks that have heating facilities, so to enable Chinese soldiers to stay in the winter. And in the long term, the power gap between the two countries will only widen. China likes to take a relatively dismissive view about the capability of Indian defense industry. And they think India defense scientists used to overestimate Indian capability to build indigenous military capabilities. So the time is really on the Chinese side. The Chinese always make this historical comparison, which is China, India, their national economic capacity was very similar at the end of the Cold War. But now the Chinese GDP is 5 times larger than India's, which has shown that the Chinese system is better and superior. So in the long run, China shouldn't worry, time is on our side. And there is no real concern about India military and security policy. In some sense, I think such perception is very similar to Chinese perception of the bilateral nuclear relationship. About the nuclear relationship, the Chinese thinking is the Indian nuclear modernization is also mostly driven by internal factors. India wants to get national prestige. India wants to use nuclear power to strengthen its international status. So its nuclear build-up is not driven by external threats, and certainly not from Chinese military threats. And therefore, the thinking goes, there is nothing that China can do to reassure India on nuclear and security issues. And India's growing nuclear capability is not a serious concern to China too. China feels that its own nuclear power is more superior. Chinese nuclear modernization is really looking at the United States. So the China-India nuclear gap is only going to widen over time. And even though India is busy working on a number of high-tech range missiles, sea-based nuclear deterrent capability, hypersonic weapons, missile defense, anti-satellite counter-space technologies, but those do not really appear to concern Chinese experts. And the recent border clash between the two countries certainly would further increase India's threat perception over China, but that has not been fully recognized by most Chinese experts. In a recent paper I wrote together with my colleague Toby Dalton, we characterized the nuclear relationship between the two countries as a decoupled deterrence, which means there is a de facto mutual nuclear deterrence relationship between China and India, but neither side is severely concerned about its future stability. China's nuclear policy very much focuses on the United States, and China is not worried about India. China feels very self-confident. And India, it has concerns about China's growing nuclear power, but India is not panicking. India will continue building up its nuclear and strategic military capabilities based on the perceived Chinese threats. So the outcome is with Chinese and Indian nuclear modernization, those developments will put more threat and pressure on Pakistan. It could lead to a less stable strategic situation in South Asia. It could make military tensions and conflicts between India and Pakistan more likely to happen, even could increase the risk of the use of nuclear weapons between the two South Asian countries. And China is worried about that prospect because it worries about the safety of its own economic investments and personnel security in this region. And there are growing Chinese research and thinking about how China can play a mediating role between India and Pakistan to help stabilize the strategic balance in South Asia. But I don't think Chinese experts ever come up with a concrete strategy for doing that. Whether China should focus on diplomatic or military means of mediation, there is no systematic and realistic solution. And with the border conflict with India this year, I think the Chinese leverage to mediate in the future is further undermined. Lastly, I will quickly look at the future prospect of the bilateral nuclear relationship. I think a few factors may add more uncertainties to the bilateral nuclear relationship. Politically, both countries today have very strong leaders. Both Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping are strong leaders who may resort to tough measures to defend national security. And economically, after the border clash, I think there's a general recognition that the bilateral economic interdependence will be reduced. The economic decoupling might become more serious in the long run. So the mitigating effect of economic interdependence is going to be less effective. And militarily, I think the reason that China has not been worried about a serious nuclear conflict with India is partly because China thinks that because of the tough terrain across the border region, it is unlikely for the two countries to fight a costly and a large-scale, high-intensity conventional war. But I think that assumption is now being challenged. I think modern infrastructure and advanced weaponry has been shown capable of overcoming the tough terrains and is making high intensity and high casualty conventional conflict less unimaginable between the two countries. And on the part of military technologies, China is developing a number of strategic systems that in the long run may cause concern in India, including China's missile defense capabilities, which in theory could pose a threat to India's nuclear deterrent. And geopolitically, I think the US is becoming a growing factor in Chinese geopolitical thinking. China is not really worried about American arms sale to India per se, but China is very sensitive about the geopolitical implication of any such military cooperation between the two countries and how it may contribute to a stronger military relationship between India and US. And on top of that, the lack of effective dialogues on such issues between China and India is further increasing the chances of misunderstandings between the two nations. So for all these reasons, I think it requires more attention and more careful analysis to help manage the escalating situation. With that, I will stop. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zhao. A very comprehensive overview of the strategic implications of the Sino-India border clashes. I think you've made some very important and interesting points, particularly that the pessimistic view that the confrontation is not likely to end soon. And perhaps this experience has reaffirmed the Chinese resolve and that of all its stakeholders that they will deal with India more firmly, but you're also cognizant of the risks involved. But most importantly, you said that the Chinese threat perception is primarily pivoted towards the US, and you don't see India as a great security concern. So that also sets the stage to let me invite the third speaker, Mr. Michael Kugelman, to share the US perspective on the Sino-India border clashes and its implications for the South Asian regional environment. In particular, I'll appreciate if he can also dilate upon how the new administration in Washington is likely to see the Sino-India relationship, and is there going to be a fresh look at this relationship and policies towards this region? So, Mr. Kugelman, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's great to be a part of this discussion, especially given the distinguished status of my fellow panelists, and also this is a very important, timely, salient topic. So thank you for including me. So in my time allotted, I'll offer some thoughts on the broader geopolitical implications of the Ladakh crisis and what lessons these implications may present or pose for the incoming Biden administration. So I'll highlight what I see as four key geopolitical implications emerging from this crisis. One of them is that the Ladakh crisis underscores India's growing diplomatic problems in its own backyard in recent months. It now has a hot border, so to speak, with both of its top rivals, Pakistan and China. Beyond that, it has been mired in another border crisis with Nepal. Its relationship with Bangladesh, which had experienced some significant forward movement in recent years, that relationship has taken a bit of a plunge thanks to a new citizenship law in India that Dhaka has taken issue with because it believes the law accuses Bangladesh of being discriminatory toward religious minorities. India also keeps getting written out of a peace and reconciliation process script in Afghanistan, even as many key regional players, including Pakistan, have been very engaged. And of course, India's relationship with Pakistan has been particularly fraught since August 2019, when New Delhi revoked Article 370 of its constitution and stripped Jammu and Kashmir of its special autonomous status, a move that, as Dr. Tong mentioned, likely also contributed, at least in part, to China's decision to stage its provocations in Ladakh earlier this year. And these neighborhood challenges are problematic for India, both policy-wise and reputationally. One of the Modi government's signature policies is its neighborhood first policy, which is meant to shore up relations with its South Asian neighbors. And yet it really has struggled on many levels to achieve that policy. Additionally, India, or New Delhi, is keen to project itself globally as a rising power, as a responsible global player. And yet it's difficult to make that argument if you're having trouble getting along with your own neighbors and if you're bogged down in your own neighborhood. A second key geopolitical implication emerging from the Ladakh crisis, as I see it, which really emerges from the first one, is that China's footprint in South Asia is really growing. And clearly the main accelerant of Beijing's growing reach in the region is BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. And it's important to remember that there are 4 South Asia-focused envisioned aspects of BRI. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor in Pakistan is the one that we hear about the most, but there is also the Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar Economic Corridor, which India has not surprisingly declined to be a part of, a trans-Himalayan corridor involving Nepal, and a maritime Silk Road initiative enveloping Bangladesh, Maldives, and Sri Lanka. These are all different intended dimensions of the Belt and Road Initiative that encompass South Asia. But I would argue that the Ladakh crisis has illustrated that Beijing does not only use the carrot of BRI to build out its presence in the region, but also the stick of military provocations. First, in talking about recent years, it's about 3 years ago, we had the Doklam standoff, and now we've had the Ladakh crisis. And I really think, even though it's somewhat past history, one cannot overestimate the significance of that last border crisis, the Doklam standoff from 3 years back, from the summer of 2017. That dispute began when Chinese forces attempted to extend a border road, prompting Indian troops to enter the area. And I think it stood out for 3 reasons. One, that dispute involved a third country, Bhutan. Second, it was the first time, as I believe, that Indian troops engaged with China on the soil of a third country. And third, the location was very significant. The Doklam Plateau is highly strategic real estate. It leads to the Siliguri corridor, the narrow area of land that connects northeastern India to the rest of the country. And even more crucial is that the location of that Doklam standoff is firmly within India's sphere of influence. And I think what's notable is that in recent years, China has sought not only to deepen its influence in areas of South Asia where it already has a deep footprint, like Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, but in more recent years, it's been trying to extend its influence to areas like Bhutan and more recently in Ladakh, broadly speaking, where India's influence has traditionally been much stronger and defined than China's. I think that the Doklam crisis was prophetic, as it in some ways set the stage for the current crisis in Ladakh, another case of a Chinese provocation in a highly strategic space in an area very much within New Delhi's sphere of influence. A third geopolitical implication emerging from the Ladakh crisis is that the risk of regional conflict has increased. And I don't want to be alarmist. I don't want to overstate this risk. Clearly, neither side wants a war. Neither side can afford a war, especially amid the pandemic and severe economic stress, particularly in India. And I really doubt that there will be a conflict anytime soon, but the environment is increasingly volatile, and that raises the prospects of a miscalculation that could lead to a dangerous escalation. As we've already discussed, it's not only India-China relations, but also India-Pakistan relations that are experiencing one of their worst lows in years. And New Delhi and Islamabad appear to worry that the other will take advantage of the Ladakh crisis to harm the other. New Delhi worries that Pakistan will try to take advantage of India being bogged down and distracted on its northern border with China by intensifying pressure on India on its western border with Pakistan, whether through scaling up cross-border shelling or even by sending non-state militant assets across the border into Kashmir to stage attacks on Indian security forces. Pakistan appears to worry that India, stymied by its relative lack of capacity to retaliate militarily against China, could take out its frustrations on its weaker Pakistani rival, either by covertly partnering with anti-state forces in Pakistan to sponsor attacks on CPEC or other Chinese interests in Pakistan, or by making some sort of move in disputed areas of Pakistan that are claimed by India and are envisioned to be areas of seapat construction, such as Gilgit-Baltistan. And India, in recent months, well before the Ladakh crisis broke out, had been intensifying rhetorically those long-standing threats. Now, even if these fears in both capitals of a three-way conflict are misplaced, and they very well may be, the mere fact that both India and Pakistan are harboring, projecting these fears is cause for concern, as it ensures a high level of tensions at a very delicate moment. A fourth and final implication of this Ladakh crisis is that US-India relations certainly stand to further improve, but with a potential catch. Looking at the Trump administration over its years in power, it's viewed New Delhi as a key partner in US efforts to build out its Indo-Pacific strategy because it has seen India as an emerging power, both economic and military, with the capacity to work with the US to counterbalance Beijing. The administration also sees India and the US united in their concern about China's growing power and the threat that it poses to Indian and US interests. And the Ladakh crisis, as the Trump administration has seen this, underscores the harm that China can inflict on India. And I think it's quite telling that during the course of this Ladakh crisis, the US government, the Trump administration, took on a more public role than is typically the case when you have these border spats. And of course, these border spats happen fairly frequently. Usually when you have these border standoffs between India and China, the US stays relatively quiet publicly. It may offer intelligence support to India, something like that, but that's about it. But in the case of the Ladakh crisis, a number of senior US leaders, including Ambassador Wells, who until her recent retirement was the top South Asia official at the State Department, Representative Eliot Engel, the chair of the House International Relations Committee at the time, Mark Meadows, President Trump's chief of staff, and even Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, they were all critical, very overtly, very explicitly critical of China for its actions in Ladakh. And I think that the Washington's more public response this time around is certainly a function of an increasingly toxic and hostile US-China relationship. But I think it's also an indication of its concern about its strategic partner, its envisioned strategic partner, India, getting embroiled in a dispute with China that was deadly in this case. But here's the catch that I was referring to about this opportunity for US-India relations posed by the crisis coming with the catch. Certainly, we could all agree, I think, that the India-China border dispute can strengthen the US-India relationship because it underscores their shared concern about China. It has worsened India-China relations. It could prompt New Delhi to move closer to the US. But at the same time, more into the longer term, it may risk exposing the limits of US-India partnership because it may highlight India's limitations in pushing back against China, which is the very thing that the US hopes India will be able to do per the Indo-Pacific strategy. So what do I mean by this? Well, India experienced, or it saw provocations by China. There were PLA forces entering areas that India considers its own, and yet its retaliatory options have been relatively limited, aside from economic punishments, which are really meant to appease an angry public, the banning of all those apps, and so forth. India is the less powerful rival vis-a-vis China. I think that's quite clear in terms of conventional military capacity. Additionally, if India formally were to move into the US camp, which is a huge if for sure, and if the two were to become true allies, then there would be great pressure on India to engage in more operational cooperation with the US. This is what the US tends to expect of its top strategic partners. The US would want India to engage in joint patrols with the US in the waters of the Indo-Pacific, for example. This is something that India has long resisted. And if India does move closer to the US and it continues to resist this type of operational collaboration, then that could impact US-India relations, because I think the idea here is that if India does not agree to that type of alliance behavior after essentially becoming an ally of the US, then when would it ever agree? And it is noteworthy that even after the Galwan clash, or the deadly clash in June, the Indian government was insisting very emphatically that it would never join an alliance system and that it remains focused on strategic autonomy. And Dr. Jaishankar, the foreign minister, actually said that. I think he said something to the effect that India will never join the alliance system. That said, we are seeing indications of where the US-India partnership is going and how it is aiming to address the two concerns I just mentioned, e.g. the Indian capacity constraints or lack thereof to take on China, and also how India and the US would aim to strike a balance between alliance and alignment. So the Quad has already been mentioned. The Quad appears to be revitalized in great part, but not exclusively, due to the India-China spat. I think its resurgence can be seen as a force in numbers type message that targets Beijing. In effect, India and the US are willing to work multilaterally in a formal sense to counterbalance China. Given that all four Quad countries for the first time will be participating in this upcoming maritime exercise, there are indications that the Quad may soon evolve from a mere dialogue, which it is now, to some type of construct that takes on some operational dimensions, even if only in modest form. And second, the BECA agreement, which was mentioned as well, recently concluded by the US and India, is huge. It was in the works for some time. It had been negotiated for a very long time, but it takes on added significance against the backdrop of the Ladakh crisis. And I think the timing is important. It does give India considerable strategic advantage in the region, in that through its provision of sensitive US intelligence to India, it better enables New Delhi to track the location and movements of its rivals, whether we're talking about PLA forces across the border, or even perhaps Chinese submarines many miles away, or Pakistani forces or terrorists in the region across the border. India will be in a better position to have a better sense as to where these threats are and how they threaten India. And there's really, I think that there's no reason at all to believe that the US would be concluding a BECA-like agreement with Pakistan anytime soon. And I know that over time, there has been a tendency in Islamabad to want the US to provide the same treatment to Pakistan that it does to India in these types of contexts. But I think we could all agree, given the nature of the US-India relationship and the US-Pakistan relationships, we're not going to see any type of BECA-like agreement concluded between the US and Pakistan. So what does this all mean for the incoming administration? Keep in mind, first of all, I don't mean to state the obvious, that everything that I've said about the Trump administration in terms of its views on China, India-China relations, US-India relations, all of that holds true for the incoming Biden administration. Biden will support US-India partnership. He's long been a friend of India. He's long been a huge proponent of US-India partnership. He certainly worries about the threat posed by China to the US, to India, to the Indo-Pacific region. It is notable that Biden is open, or he has stated that he is open to pursuing cooperation with China in areas where it is possible, climate change, health, non-proliferation, to be very specific. These are areas that he himself has laid out. But let's be very clear here. Biden, contrary to what some critics have alleged, Biden is not about to go easy on China. I think that if you look at what's happening strategically in the region, increasingly, or what in Washington are perceived to be increasingly aggressive Chinese policies and actions in the South China Sea, along the India-China border, and in Hong Kong and Taiwan, all of this threatens key US partners and by extension, US interests. And President Biden will not take that lightly. And none of this should be surprising, because when it comes to US perceptions of China or India or US-India relations, there's a strong bipartisan consensus in Washington. To be sure, I imagine that with Biden, you'll get a president that would be much less sharp around the edges when it comes to rhetoric and messaging on China. He will want to be more conciliatory. As I had said before, he would be more willing to cooperate. And certainly, President Biden probably would not view China as a threat in the same exact context as Trump. Certainly, President Biden will see China as a threat to US economic primacy. He may not see it as an existential threat in the way that President Trump has laid out that threat. But as I said before, President Biden will see China as a threat to US interests in the broader Indo-Pacific region. So what are the lessons here to conclude for the Biden administration? Clearly, given how things have played out to this point, India and the United States should be encouraged about prospects for the relationship, but they'll also need to be a bit cautious in the context of the opportunity for stronger relations afforded by the India-China spat. Expectations will need to be carefully calibrated. I think that the two sides will need to explore ways to transform the relationship into a truly strategic one that goes beyond what we've already had a lot of: arms sales, intelligence sharing, technology transfers, and other largely transactional measures. So ideally, I think the Biden administration would look to initiate some type of sustained strategic dialogue that the Trump administration had not been interested in doing outside of the largely tactically focused 2+2 dialogue. And I think this notion of strategic dialogue, US-India strategic dialogue, may be of interest to a Biden administration after it gets over the initial priorities focused on domestic issues in the US. Second, Washington and New Delhi will need to think through the implications for US-India relations of a potential conflict between India and China. The current crisis raises the possibility, albeit remote, of a future Indian conflict with China. There is little chance that America would intervene militarily on India's behalf in a hypothetical conflict. And in fact, New Delhi would be unlikely to seek US intervention. It would be content with tactical and intelligence assistance. However, if there is to be any chance, and again, I'm speaking very hypothetically here, any chance of any type of US military intervention in an India-China conflict, there would need to be at the very least some notable changes in the US-India relationship. These would entail a series of new security guarantees and other accords that go well beyond the foundational agreements that bolster the US-India military partnership today. In other words, India would need to be perceived by Washington as a treaty ally, like a South Korea or Japan. And given India's insistence on staying outside of the alliance system, such changes are not on the cards. Third, the increasing volatility of the line of actual control suggests a need for the incoming Biden administration to adjust the Trump administration's framing of Indo-Pacific. The seriousness of the Ladakh crisis and the likelihood that the deadly clash back in June could mean more violence and future standoffs between the two countries illustrates how the LAC is a new flashpoint in Asia. US policymakers, though, have tended to view the Indo-Pacific through a sea-based lens, and not surprisingly, American maritime cooperation with littoral states constitutes a core pillar of cooperation within the Indo-Pacific policy. And yet, if the Biden administration wants its core Asia policy to focus on counterbalancing Chinese power, and that policy will likely consist of the Indo-Pacific policy with a new name, then it will need to expand the geographic purview beyond the South China Sea, the Senkaku Islands, and other sea-based theaters for Chinese power projection and provocations, and situated in land-based spaces such as the LAC as well. This broader geographic scope, I think, would strengthen US-India relations. It would also serve US interests more broadly by expanding the scope for cooperation with Indo-Pacific states within the ambit of America's core Asia policy. Now, to conclude, during its last year in power, the Trump administration has indicated that it was already going in that direction. I think you'll all remember that earlier this year, while speaking in New Delhi, Matt Pottinger, the Deputy National Security Advisor, he declared that the Indo-Pacific stretches from, quote, California to Kilimanjaro, suggesting that the whole South Asia region, including presumably Pakistan, is a part of the Indo-Pacific. And I see little reason why President Biden would disagree with such an assessment, given the concerns that his administration will certainly bring to the table about China's activities in the broader Indo-Pacific. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kugelman. A very comprehensive and rich assessment of not just what has happened and what is also likely to happen. And some very important points you made that perhaps the incoming Biden administration is going to continue to see China as a concern, but perhaps not in the same manner as the Trump administration saw. And also you pointed out some possibility of cooperation in areas of climate change and non-proliferation. And I'm sure our experts will look at other areas of cooperation in the coming days under the new administration. That brings me to the last speaker of today's webinar, Lieutenant General Ishfaq Nadeem Ahmed, the former Chief of General Staff of Pakistan Army. He will be giving Pakistan's perspective on the strategic implications of the Sino-India border clashes. More specifically, we expect him to elaborate how it is going to affect Pakistan's relations with China and India, and more specifically, Pakistan's threat perception and strategic calculations towards India. General Nadeem, the floor is yours. General Nadeem? So you need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes, sir, you're audible, sir.
Thanks very much. I would like to thank Upfront Center for the Aerospace and Security Studies, especially its president, Air Chief Marshal Kaleem Sadat, for affording us all this opportunity for an intellectual discourse on the region, which is home to 1/3, or in some cases, depends how you look at it, nearly half of the world's population, and one which will be the engine for economic growth of the entire world. This region and its future has implications for the United States, the Middle East, the Pacific, especially South China Sea, Russia, and even Africa, to name only a few. As we would be aware that there are 1 million migrants from China who have moved to Africa. The region's future will also be driven by the US approach towards it. This driver, i.e. the US approach toward it, would, in my opinion, remain significant for the next few years before it gradually declines and the region itself begins to become a more influential and potent driver of its own future. It will become from being a vessel to becoming an increasingly transformative actor in its own right. It is therefore important for all regional countries, in my opinion, to cooperate by reducing the impediments and to engage cooperatively with the US. Without attention to either, regional progress would elude us. The logical question, therefore, is, will this be achievable? The answer to this has to be framed within the context of the following relatively recent developments. Number one, Sino-Indian border dispute. Number two, revocation of the Article 370 and changing of the special status of Indian occupied Kashmir. And thirdly, Biden's presidential victory. Let me state the obvious, but sometimes obvious needs to be restated. As long as US looks at China as a competitor bordering on being an enemy, and therefore props up India against China, and as long as China feels threatened by US and its support to India, and thus props up Pakistan against India and Iran against US, and as long as Pakistan and India do not resolve their differences, primarily Kashmir, the region will remain at best what I call constructively constrained, and at worst irrevocably caged with its much trumpeted strength, i.e. its population becoming a fatal burden. Let me begin by focusing on the psychological impact rather than anything else of the recent Ladakh crisis. While we need to look at the strategic implications of the Sino-Indian border dispute, we should not lose sight of the psychological impact it has had or will have, not only on the Indian mind and Chinese psyche, but Pakistani as well. China has once again shown its ability to defeat India, albeit at a much lower and narrower scale compared to 1962. This Indian defeat, coming on the heels of unsuccessful air action against Pakistan, would have negative psychological impact with regard to the abilities of the Indian military. Failure, I suspect, would be attributed to lack of suitable equipment rather than on lack of preparation. This in turn may spur Indian military to make a pitch for more modern equipment. While this modernization may not be of great significance vis-a-vis China, it will give Pakistan a reason of its own to ask for more defense spending from its government. Continued budget freeze accepted voluntarily by Pakistan Army last year may not remain possible anymore. Similarly, recent failures may lead to enhanced Indian violations of LOC with Pakistan, a point which Michael has already made, and I would like to reinforce that. This can take many forms. Such actions could be useful diversions for the Indian public from the recent happenings with regard to China. Continuing US support to India with the purpose of undermining China and the recent border conflict would perhaps bring Pakistan and China even closer, enhancing the strategic, political, diplomatic, and economic relations. And as one Chinese general said, Pakistan may begin to look more and more like China's Israel. This border dispute notwithstanding, the Sino-Indian relationship has evolved, but Islamabad has maintained confidence in its historically strategic partnership with China against India, with little concern that the Sino-Indian economic relationship would cause China to re-evaluate its support on Pakistan's core concerns with India. The Sino-Indian differences and recent incidents are unlikely to have any impact on China-India trade, which is approximately $90 billion. With both China's and India's economic growth on the decline, neither would want a confrontation which could affect negatively the trade. Unless Sino-Indian economic ties make a dent in the current cooperative projects of Pakistan-China relationship, Islamabad, in fact, it may help for China to be a more effective moderator, better than perhaps USA, to spur improved Pakistan-India relations. India is often cited that its real adversary is China, and its preparations, military and others, are towards that end. Pakistan is often downplayed as an adversary in official Indian circles, as a Chinese friend, the honorable panelist, was alluding to China downplaying India as an adversary. This Indian attitude vis-a-vis Pakistan gets further enhanced due to US support and effort to build India as a counterweight to China. While all of this, to some extent, undermines Pakistan's anti-India rhetoric, it contrarily strengthens Pakistan-China bond, as China looks at Pakistan as its own counterweight to India. A trilateral, and I'm aware that Indian government is severely opposed to it, but a trilateral as proposed by the Chinese sometime back, involving Pak, China, India, would be useful in developing at least coexistence, if not outright cooperation. China-India relations would remain shadowed without improvement in Pakistan-India relations. China routinely supports Pakistan in international fora, often to the detriment of India. And I'm thinking in this regard, China's opposition of India's bid for a membership to the Nuclear Suppliers Group, China's blocking of Masood Azhar's name in the UN's blacklist, and CPEC, etc. The recent conflict goes to prove, and this is again, I'm reinforcing what Michael has said a while ago, that regional powers, that is neighbors, can undertake limited ventures with regard to operations and border disputes without regard to the support their adversary may have of a distant power, i.e. USA. While this conflict was going on, Pakistan remained oblivious to the advantages that it could have gained because of this conflict. A joint diplomatic effort to convince India to revisit Kashmir with regard to the recent happenings in Kashmir, in coordination with China, could have brought certain advantages to China and Pakistan. Limited territorial disputes can lead to use of force, even between two nuclear states. Not once, and this is important, during the months of this conflict was any mention made by anyone about the dangers of military conflict, howsoever limited, leading to a nuclear escalation. Compare that with an Indo-Pak standoff, during which there is always excessive hype about a nuclear escalation. Pakistan has always reiterated that there is no space for a conventional war, yet Kargil proved otherwise. Wars should be avoided, but in my opinion, there is and always will be space for a limited conflict between India and Pakistan. The Sino-Indian conflict proves this yet again. presence of nuclear weapons, however, would keep the conflict limited. Pakistan and India, in my opinion, have to decide whether having nuclear weapons provides stability, considering there still remains a space for war. If disarmament was to take place without improved relations, would it not lead to greater instability in the region, increasing the chances of an all out war? Considering Indian conventional superiority vis-a-vis Pakistan, absence of Pakistan's nuclear weapons is a sure recipe for an Indian initiated conflict. Having seen the lack of professionalism, and I'm now talking about the current situation with regard to Ladakh, having seen the lack of professionalism and inadequacy of resources, the recent conflict would have added to Pakistan's confidence vis-a-vis its ability to grapple with India if things came to such a pass. However, it has actually enhanced the chances of a limited Pakistan-India conflict across the line of control. In my opinion, the details notwithstanding, China picked up an opportune time to escalate the border tensions. India, under Prime Minister Modi, had already alienated itself in the region. Nepal, Bangladesh, Bhutan, and the revocation of Article 370 alienated Pakistan to the extreme and afforded a good opportunity for China to take advantage of the situation offered. The Chinese actions along the Indian border have emboldened the already marginalized smaller regional states against India. With Chinese support, it is expected that these smaller states will be more vociferous in their demands towards India. China has shown yet again that it is the most powerful player in the region. At the same time, China affords a reason or is the reason that brings US and India closer. This bonhomie will come under stress due to Modi's anti-democratic and anti-human rights actions. This will happen more so, in my opinion, because of President-elect Biden's recent election to the presidency. During Biden's campaign, it was stated repeatedly that if elected, he would raise the issue of Kashmir with India and also convey its concerns on a recent Indian law that discriminates against Muslims. President Biden's administration is likely to support the Iran nuclear deal, or at least consider reinforcement of the Iran nuclear deal, bringing Iran to some extent out of isolation. This would help US in their peace efforts in Afghanistan, as at least one potential spoiler would perhaps be less inclined to disrupt the peace process. At the same time, the new US administration, in my opinion, is less likely to try for a total military drawdown from Afghanistan as envisaged by the Trump administration. The withdrawal of US forces, therefore, from Afghanistan is not inevitable. This, in turn, could jeopardize the Afghan peace process, or if not jeopardize, it could at least delay or create impediments in the Afghan peace process, considering that one of the major requirements of the Taliban is for all the US forces to withdraw from Afghanistan. This, in turn, would bring greater pressure on Pakistan with regard to bringing the Taliban to a negotiated settlement. And this would bring a considerable amount of potential duress on Pakistan if it happens as I've hypothesized. Nonetheless, such a development, however, would bring under stress the US-Israel relations. If the deal with Iran is brought back or is considered by the Biden administration, it would bring under stress the US-Israel relations. The Indian revocation of Article 370 in Jammu and Kashmir has in some ways spurred Pakistan as well to look at doing something with regard to declaring Gilgit-Baltistan a province, albeit a provisional one. This actually could create difficulties with regard to the Kashmiri populace on both sides of the border, and it could potentially demoralize the Muslim leadership in Jammu and Kashmir and deflate their spirits, and may also harm Pakistan's long-standing stance on Kashmir. In conclusion, what I want to re-emphasize is I want to emphasize 7 points. First, the region's growth potential is dependent on reducing intra-regional disputes. It is also dependent on its relations with the United States. Pakistan remains a central part of China's transition from a regional power to a global one. India continues to provide the strategic glue that binds Pakistan and China. Number 2, there is likely to be, and this opinion obviously is contrary to what Michael Kugelman was saying, there's likely to be a more internationalist approach followed by the new Biden administration rather than an isolationist one, which bodes well for US-China relations. Number 3, the revival of the nuclear deal, if effected, with Iran may become possible, although such an eventuality would stress US-Israel relations. 4, without improvement in Pakistan-India relations, and to some extent US-Iran relations, an important reason for instability, though not the only one in Afghanistan, will continue to fester. 5, a trilateral, Pakistan, China, India, as suggested by China recently, focusing on immediate issues of concern, may be a useful first step to enhance confidence if India agrees to that. 6, because of the fairly strained Pakistan-India relations, a back-channel effort may be necessary to achieve a thaw between India and Pakistan. And lastly, the period since 9/11 has seen China sit on the sidelines of a war that it wanted neither the Taliban nor the US to win. As the US withdrawal has loomed closer and the Taliban threat and the terrorist threat grown, China's view is likely to be in favor of stability, even if it involves cooperating with Washington. So this provides a degree of positiveness because whatever happens in the region, in my opinion, it is dictated primarily by the United States over the next few years. And this influence of United States is gradually reduced. And obviously how China fares with regard to the United States. So China looking at 2049 as the year when it wants to, or it aims, or it may be aiming at taking over economically, politically from the United States. So that remains a concern, but I think that it is time that US and China actually try to cooperate more, and that would only bring out whatever good there is for the region to accomplish from its population and the growth that would only be possible because of US-China relations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, General Nadeem, for very comprehensive and insightful analysis of a very complex situation. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we've heard the 4 very illustrious panelists encompass different aspects of the Sino-India border clashes and its strategic implications for South Asia region. Now we come to the question and answer session. We have quite a few questions and comments from around the world. So I'll share these briefly with the panel. Air Marshal Ashfaq Arai has asked Mr. Rahul Roy Chaudhary a question regarding the UN Security Council resolutions and the bilateral agreements on IIOK. He believes that the Indus Water Treaty is also an issue that India has not been abiding by. So can India claim to be cooperating with like-minded countries for rule-based international order. Mr. Rahul, would you like to comment?
Well, thank you for that question, Marshal Ashfaq. I think, as you know, the position from Delhi is that what happened on the 5th of August 2019 was an internal decision for India to revoke Article 370 and divide Kashmir into two union territories controlled by the central government in Delhi. It was a controversial decision, no doubt. We know that the following several months, Indian diplomats around the world were a defensive position posture on this. But we also know that internationally, I think there was a sense that the impact on India for its move, has been marginal in that sense in actual operational terms. Having said that, I think that it was fairly clear that the Delhi also sees this as an internal issue that has not affected the borders with Pakistan, that it does not impact in any way the line of control and the international borders. So there is, I think, a sense that India was very much looking at this in a domestic framework, though of course it had, as I mentioned, international ramifications. But I think on the rules of sort of international rules in that sense that India has signed up to is a much broader concept, looking at not only the maritime but also in other areas. So my sense is that I don't see this as a contradiction between India's perception and principles on the rule of law, but I think clearly it was a controversial decision that India took for domestic reasons.
Thank you, Rahul. Next question is aimed at Dr. Zhao from Ambassador Libas Jilani. He has asked you that he would like to ask you that the Chinese perspective on the recently signed security agreements between the US and India, such as COM-CASA and BECA. Would China be concerned about the destabilizing impact of these agreements on regional and global security? And what could be Chinese response to these developments? Dr. Zhao?
Sure. Thank you for the question. I think China understands that the background of the bilateral agreements is very much relevant to the perceived threat, the perceived common threat from China. So it's very much about joint efforts to contain Chinese growing influence and military power. I think in terms of BECA, which helps India get better access to American geospatial intelligence, which in turn may help Indian military navigation, targeting, including the targeting of its missiles, drones, etc. I think it certainly raises concerns in China because of the increase of Indian military capabilities. But I think China generally feels confident that China's own capability for military navigation, positioning China's own Beidou GPS system is now fully functional and continuously improving. China has the Gaofen high-resolution surveillance satellites, and China just a couple of days ago launched another Gaofen satellite into orbit. So China's own domestic, geospatial intelligence capability is improving very quickly, and China doesn't feel particularly challenged by this specific agreement between U.S. and India. And if necessary, I think China feels it has the adequate military means to interfere with such American intelligence collection technology, in addition to direct ascent anti-satellite weapons. China has, reportedly has been developing other softer means of anti-satellite weapons, which can be tapped to interfere with American space-based intelligence collection systems. In terms of Comcast, which provides better communication between the U.S. and the Indian military, in the end, it could help increase the so-called interoperability between American and Indian military forces. I don't think this raises a military level concern to China, but I think China would be really worried about the geopolitical implication of such military interoperability. Chinese traditional view is the US has been very good at using such military level interoperability as a tactic to strengthen geopolitical ties, to build up its military alliance network. And this tactic has been applied to countries like South Korea and Japan. And now US may be applying the same tactic to India. So I think it may lead to China raising, putting more geopolitical pressure on India to avoid a closer US-India military alliance relationship in the future. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Tom. Mr. Muzammil has asked a question which perhaps both Rahul and Tom can address. How Sino-India clashes is likely to end, and is there a possibility of involving any mediator to reduce tensions in the region, as US doesn't like to interfere directly? Rahul and then Tom.
Sure. I think that we've seen since June a series of meetings between the military commanders in the area, including diplomats. There has been attempts at de-escalation. Today, I think there was another meeting that had a positive outcome where there seems to have been a sense of returning in one part of the Galwan Valley, returning to the status quo ante before June. So this is going to be a long, drawn-out process. It will take months, if not a year or more. As we heard from Dr. Tong, this is a long-term issue for China, as it is for India. So I think it's important that both countries actually focus on ensuring that there is no further risk of escalation on the line of actual control. In terms of mediators, I think in a way, it will be difficult for India to accept any third country on this. It is no doubt in a weaker position, as we've heard from Dr. Tong militarily, but it is building up its capabilities. But I think the sense has been that it will prefer to deal with Beijing directly on this. And I think it is notable that a lot of the, what Michael Kuzelman was talking about, a lot of US activism that came into it was very useful for India in a way for diplomatic purposes, but operationally, that is not the way India would like to go through, whether it is the US or whether it is in any other country. It would deal on this issue bilaterally rather than multilaterally.
Tom?
I very much agree. I think both China and India are very proud powers. I don't think there is real room for a third party or US mediating between the two. It's ultimately up to the two countries to resolve their border disagreements. For the near term, I think both countries think the stakes are too high for either to make significant concessions. In the Chinese case, China feels that it is fully capable of accepting costs, including costs of maintaining massive military deployment in this region to keep this pressure on the Indian side. And China feels that India wouldn't be able to sustain this situation in the long run because of the huge economic and logistical costs. So I think both, at least China will try to keep the pressure on. I don't think there is any serious risk of significant escalation in the foreseeable future. At the political level, both countries wanted to avoid major conflicts, but I worry very much about the long-term implications to the bilateral security relationship. I worry that this continuous confrontation at the border could gradually transform the bilateral security relationship to the worst. And with growing threat perception on both sides toward each other, this could stimulate more investment into military capabilities against each other. This could further destabilize their nuclear relationship, which so far has been kept at a relatively stable level. So I worry this boiling tension could lead to long-term arms competition between the two countries.
Thank you, Tong. Staying on the issue of mediation, I have another very interesting question from Ms. Satara Noor for Tong and Michael. She has asked that Tong referred to Chinese desire to play the role of a mediator between India and Pakistan, while US earlier used to play that role. So do you see in the growing hostilities between China and India on one hand and China and the US on the other hand, what would the third party role look like in a future Pakistan-India conflict? Tong and Michael. Yeah.
If I can go first briefly, sure. I don't think I have a good answer. I mentioned there is increasing discussion before the border conflict this year in China about the need for China to step in and fill the gap of the United States. And hopefully China can play a moderator's role in a future India and Pakistan confrontation. I don't think there was enough time for Chinese strategists to think deeply about this issue, including about specific ways China can impose influence. Certainly, there was discussion about China using its diplomatic leverage because at that time, China-India relationship was still generally stable and was believed to be improving. So China thought it would have sufficient diplomatic influence and leverage in both countries. There was very little discussion of what military means China can bring to mediate and put pressure. But I think quickly with the border clash, the deteriorating China-India relationship, the growing China-US competition, I haven't seen any subsequent and substantive discussions. I worry that China will gradually understand its own leverage in mediating a South Asian conflict in the future has been seriously undermined.
Okay, thank you, Michael.
Yeah, so thanks to Satara for that great question about mediation. I think that on this question of what the third-party mediation should look like in future India-Pakistan crisis, I think one needs to distinguish between a proactive role played by a third-party mediator to help reduce tensions, just generally, versus a more reactive role to step in and actually try to diffuse a crisis or an actual conflict. I think there are differences. The U.S. Has really never been very interested in the first option. It hopes that there'll be a dynamic that will ensure that tensions between India and Pakistan don't spiral out of control, but the US prefers to play a hands-off role in that regard. But indeed, when there actually is a bona fide crisis, the US has continued to step up and try to play the role of crisis manager. And that did happen in the most recent military crisis between India and Pakistan last year, and the Pulwama Balakot crisis. But certainly, given the dynamics of the region that we've been discussing, given just how bad the India-Pakistan relationship is now, and given how bad the India-China relationship is, it does seem to me that the next India-Pakistan crisis could be quite serious. I mean, if there were to be another Pulwama-like scenario where you have an attack on Indian troops, India would blame it on Pakistan for sure. And you really have to worry what could happen. It could be much more difficult, or more difficult than it typically is, for the U.S. as the role of a crisis mediator, a crisis manager, and that suggests a need for other players. I don't. It shouldn't just be the U.S. that is getting involved. And I do understand that in the last crisis, the last military crisis between India and Pakistan, you did have some other players trying to step up. Whether you're talking about some players from Europe, some players from the Gulf. China for sure. So I think that we need to look at efforts to be more multilateral and broad when it comes to those that would want to mediate. Just a quick note on the question of mediation in the China-India dispute. I agree with what the other speakers said before, that there shouldn't be a need for external mediation, just because in the past, whenever you have these China-India border standoffs, generally they are resolved bilaterally and very successfully. Even in this case, which has been certainly the worst India-China border standoff in years, even here, there does appear to be a genuine intent and desire on the part of Beijing and New Delhi to resolve things on their own. But certainly, one player that I think we need to think about here, not the US, but Russia. We haven't really talked about Russia. There had been speculation that the Russians were trying to bring the two sides together to talk about the issue. Both sides have rejected that. Russia itself has indicated that it doesn't want to play a role of mediator. But Russia has a very interesting status in this context, in that it has a long-standing relationship with India, and it has a very interesting and at this point in time workable, good relationship with China. So I think that we have to keep the Russia factor in the back of our heads. Now, certainly the strategic implications for Washington of its Russian rival trying to step up its game and trying to play the role of a mediator in this very troubled state of affairs in the line of actual control, that can be problematic. But the Russia factor is very interesting here. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Mr. Umar has a very interesting question. Perhaps, Rahul, you'd like to have a go at it. Do you think China has tested the Indian nuclear deterrence in this crisis? Or what's your take on it?
No, I think that we've heard from the earlier panelists that in this crisis, there was no nuclear element to it in that sense. I think very often we sometimes, take sort of the wrong lessons from a crisis. And I think this crisis, notwithstanding what others have said, has been I mean, this is not a crisis that has been fought with weapons, in the sense traditional, firearms, etc. It was much more sort of brutal than that in a way. But I think one thing was fairly clear, that on no occasion was there any element, or nor did it deserve to really come up, was the nuclear issue. And as I think General Ishfaq has said earlier correctly, that in the India-Pakistan, clashes, the nuclear dimension does come up regularly. But on this one, there was no need, and as far as I'm aware, there was no aspect, or there was no nuclear aspect to this clash.
There's another interesting question for you from Mr. Hassan Mustaba. Do you see some significant economic implications of the Sino-India conflict for South Asia vis-a-vis regional trade, Rahul?
Again, I'd refer to General Ishfaq Nadeem. I think he's absolutely correct that neither India nor China want to give up on their trade, $90 billion trade. So India's sort of response was also very measured in a way. It was political, yes, partly economic, but not affecting trade. On the 5G, remember 5G is in India. Huawei is in India, but Huawei was not asked to leave India. It may not compete for the 5G competition taking place soon, but it's still there. So I think it's very important to put all this in context. And my concern in this discussion is that sometimes, we're looking at aspects and sort of, speculating where we need to put everything in the context of reality and pragmatism. And in this respect, clearly, But I think trade issues, something that India, not China, would want to suffer. Yes, investment into India by Chinese companies has stalled. It may resume in that sense as one of these sort of confidence building measures, but we're not there yet. But I think it's very important to put this, the clash, the India-China clash, in context of the India-China relationship and of the neighborhood.
Okay, I think we are running out of time and we have a lot of questions and comments from around the world. So I'll probably take the last two questions. There's one question from Mr. Adnan Maqsood. We are missing a very important aspect in this conflict. First, how Russia is coming into Sino-India conflict. Second, what will be the role of BRICS and SCO in de-escalation? Tong, you want to have a go at it?
Well, I wish I could. Unfortunately, I haven't studied deeply on BRICS or SCO issues, so I'll defer to other panelists.
Okay, Rahul?
I think it's important to make a distinction between the bilateral nature of the tensions in India-China relations and the multilateral. Multilaterally, we are seeing that India will be hosting the SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization Heads of Government meeting at the end of November, I think, early next month. China will be there, other countries. BRICS, I think, will continue again. But possibly the momentum in that sense is going to be affected. The pace will be affected of cooperation in these multilateral fora. But I think that we have to again be circumspect, and this doesn't mean that that multilaterally that things will necessarily have to become difficult with India and China. Climate change is one issue where I think the Biden presidency, China, India would all need to work together. And I think on those issues, India is not going to lag behind in terms of seeking to work with China.
Okay, Dr. Usman Chauhan also asked the same question. And we have another question from Mr. Umar Amir. For Mr. Tong, can you elaborate on Russian factor in mediating the current tension? I think you've probably already addressed that both countries are too proud to allow any mediation. Also, you have stated that India is being instigated on US insistence, and this might provoke other middle powers as well. Do you realistically see India as a middle power in the regional geopolitics or a future equal weight to China? Rahul?
I think Dr. Tong again said it very well. If you look at the power indexes at the moment, China is way ahead of India in terms of economy, military capabilities, etc. Till last year, India's economic growth rate annually was higher than China's. But clearly, this year, India will have a negative growth of minus 10%, while China's will be positive. So I think that, we're not really looking at strict comparisons between India and China. Clearly, China is the more powerful country. No question of it. No one in India would deny that. So what does India do? What other relatively weaker powers do is work with the international community, get countries, to work with India in terms of the concerns over China. You see that in India's diplomatic relations with other countries, the US particularly, but not only. It is the EU, it is Japan, it is Australia, it is other countries in Africa, the Gulf. So I think that the differences are very clear, but I think diplomatically, Delhi is trying to sort of try to get some balance in terms of the areas that are important to it. I think the Indian Ocean is one key area where India will seek to retain its relative supremacy over China. South Asia, yes, as panelists have pointed out, India has difficult relations with not only with Pakistan but with Bangladesh and Nepal. But India has always had difficult relations with its neighbors. Again, put it in context. It is a challenge, and it's a challenge that India has to improve the relationship. But it's not an insurmountable challenge. And I think India will have to be cautious in being able to work much more closely with a country like Bangladesh, for example.
Thank you, Rahul. I think I have time just for one last question for General Ashfaq Nadeem. We have a question from Mr. Junaid Ali. He has asked that can we forecast any peace in this region either by bilateral cooperation or third-party intervention? So, do you want to end on an optimistic note or a pessimistic note, General Sahab?
I have tried to be optimistic in the talk that I made, but to be honest, to be frank, it is difficult. I mean, because there are so many factors involved, and there is obviously the US-China factor. Various panelists have spoken about it, and there is India, Pakistan, and a lot of other related issues. And therefore, I feel that while one would want a regional cooperative arrangement which works well for the region and the population of the countries of the region, but I don't think that we are there yet, and I don't think we'll be there in the short term. And therefore, this we will probably remain in a confrontationalist mode. The degree would vary, but I would like to highlight that in case of a China-India standoff, the emotions don't run as high as they would run in the case of India-Pakistan standoff. So while China and India can continue to do trade at a sector and other things, although I understand that between India and Pakistan, there is not much happening with regard to trade and all in comparative terms. But when it comes to India-Pakistan thing, the emotions run so high that it will probably be difficult to continue engagement while there is a border conflict going on, or a border dispute or escalation on the border.
Thank you so much, Jan Sahab. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think we've had a very comprehensive, rich and insightful discourse. And that brings me to the point where I have the honor of requesting the President CAS, Air Chief Marshal Kaleem Saadat, to deliver his concluding remarks. Sir.
Thank you, Dr. Mohammed Ali. I must compliment you and all the panelists for covering a lot of ground and giving your diverse perspectives on this very important matter. This is our second webinar on this subject. The first one dealt with on 2nd of June 2020, where we dealt with the tactical issues and what transpired on May 2020 and thereafter. Here, of course, the emphasis was to look to the future and forecast what is likely to happen. Ladies and gentlemen, it would be fair to say that India-China history of the past 7 decades is replete with border skirmishes on one hand and a surfeit of agreements intended to reduce tensions and live in peace on the other. The events of the past 3 decades have shown that the attempt to iron out the differences have not been entirely successful. The reasons for this failure have been multiple, but the primary one is the changing balance of power between China and the United States and the consequent geostrategic realignment. The panelists have talked about the convergence of the regional and global interests of India and the United States and how it has affected the relationship between India and China. Earlier, India tried to be friendly with China and emphasize broadening of trade and bilateral relations. But with the quadrilateral arrangement with the US, Japan, and Australia becoming more active, like Mr. Rahul said, the relationship with China deteriorated. And they certainly became much worse after the unilateral action concerning the Indian occupied Kashmir on 5th August 2019, because China outrightly rejected and condemned Indian actions at that time. As has been brought out by various panelists, the prognosis for the future is pessimistic because of the hardening positions of the two protagonists and their allied blocs. The economic and military rise of China is not welcomed by the Quad group, as well as South Korea and some ASEAN countries. A Cold War prevails in real earnest, and there is a chance of a clash both in the Himalayas and South China Sea. Militarily, India is weaker than China, as has been stated many times. However, India is using this opportunity to shore up its capabilities by military purchases from Russia, Israel, France, and the United States. India is counting on the US support to stand up to China, but the US would only sell military hardware and weapons and provide political support. The skirmishes and battles, however, would have to be fought by the Indians themselves. This is also a point made by the panelists. Sarosh Bana, executive editor of Business India, while writing for Begin Sadat Center for Strategic Study, has done a reasonably good analysis of the problem faced by India. One is, of course, his conclusion that this 1,000 square kilometers of territory that China has occupied is likely to remain within Chinese control. And that Chinese military offensive in Ladakh is not merely tactical, but has strategic object of realizing specific long-term objectives. The PLA moves are, after all, being directed by the top leadership, the Central Military Commission, which is chaired by President Xi Jinping. Chinese Han culture is goal-oriented. Its military might as well believe that if it invades a territory at will and meets little resistance, it is under no obligation to retreat on request. It is unlikely that China would withdraw from the territory it has taken. Chinese are making arrangements to stay there for the long haul. To borrow Mr. Praveen Sohane's term, they are creating an ecosystem to sustain their forces. A point made by various panelists, the more India tilts towards the US, the more pressure China will bring to bear on India in Arunachal Pradesh, which China calls South Tibet. And this point was also made by others, that the provocation caused by Home Minister Amit Shah's statement in the parliament a year ago about XI chain, Pakistan occupied Kashmir and Gilgit-Baltistan. Mr. Sarosh Bana again makes another point that Indian citizens have been looking to their leadership to lift the threat of war. Many are frustrated that while the government unhesitatingly pursues dissidents and political opponents by branding them anti-nationalists and seditious, it sidesteps confrontation with external aggressors. Delhi has offered, and I quote, Delhi has offered no resolute response even as a vast territory of the country stands forfeited and its battle-scarred soldiers are killed and maimed. In the ongoing military level talks, Beijing has leveraged the Indian Prime Minister's stance to not only consistently deny any Chinese invasion, but to accuse the Indian side of provocation. It is increasingly felt inside India that the border conflict could have been defused in the initial stages if the Prime Minister had reached out to President Xi. The questions that arise are whether Mr. Modi lacks such access or does not enjoy the confidence of Chinese hierarchy, or if there is a communication gap between the two leaders that impedes agreement. Ashley J. Tellis, in a recent interview with Shekhar Gupta of The Print, has claimed that India has been resolute in the face of Chinese threat. They have recently positioned troops on the heights dominating the southern shore of Pangong Lake, which has irked the Chinese military and is the main subject of the negotiations in the 8th round. The truth is that the situation is nowhere near peace and stability that Indians desire. India may feel justified in what it has done in IOK, but it is problematic at many levels, as has been alluded to by panelists also. It violates UN resolutions. 2, it is opposed to the will of the Kashmiri majority, the Muslims. The pretext is development, but it has resulted in cessation of normal economic activity which existed before August 2019. The human rights of the Kashmiris are being violated by extended curfews, unlawful detentions, and separation of young boys from their families, custodial killings, and blinding of people through the use of pellet guns. The oppression and suppression of the people for an extended period are not sustainable or tenable. The relocation of Hindus to the disputed territory of Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir is violation of the 4th Geneva Convention. India has, it appears, put itself in cul-de-sac. It can neither roll back the revocation of Article 370, nor is it succeeding in controlling law and order in IOK. It is looking to Quad and other allies to pull its chestnuts out of the fire. There is little chance of China returning from the territory that it is in control of. So the standoff is likely to persist, as has been concluded by almost all the panelists. However, there is a danger. With the proliferation of emerging disruptive technologies, one side, more likely India, could mistakenly come to think that it has a decisive silver bullet and use autonomous and hypersonic weapons to attack the other side's positions or assets, even for tactical gains or political effect. This could lead to serious and destructive escalation, more so if analysis and decision-making were outsourced to artificial intelligence. I hope not. Kinetic means could be used in a spur-of-the-moment response to an incident while opposing forces are arrayed in a tense situation, whether in the South China Sea or Ladakh or Aksai Chin area. As winter sets in, things are likely to be quiet due to harsh weather and terrain conditions. However, as was concluded by many panelists, in parallel, political jostling will be a constant. The trade war will continue, and cyber warfare will be used to hide behind the fog of anonymity and lack of identification. The skirmishes in the Himalayas would be overshadowed by the larger military competition and challenges to sovereignty in the Indo-Pacific region. As has been stated, US and India have signed important agreements of LEMOA, COMCASA, and more recently BECA. But the question is, will India be proxy of America in its own competition with China? Again, an issue raised by the panelists. Will India abandon its notion of strategic autonomy and become a real ally of the US? Again, an issue raised by many panelists. Over the longer term, Ashley Tellis again conjectures that in its competition with the emerging superpower China, will India become a superpower or seek an alliance with America? Ladies and gentlemen, common sense would dictate that the parties involved sit around a table and work out a modus vivendi. But the history of the rise and fall of empires informs us that there is little chance of that happening. The trajectories of the current and future empires would continue along the existing path until time decides the balance of power, or balance of relative power of both ascendant and descendant power. It's going to be a long, grueling, and tense struggle. The world as a whole faces a lot of uncertainty, unpredictability, and instability. What is needed instead is global leadership, consensus, and flexibility. Will we get it? Only time would tell. With that, I conclude my remarks, and I again thank worthy panelists for taking out time and contributing in a very substantive way in our understanding of the prognosis for the future insofar as these clashes are involved. So we will carry out a detailed analysis of the conclusions that you have made or the points that you have made, and hopefully create a mosaic which is more intelligible to us. Thank you very much. All the best. Good night, good day, good evening, wherever you are.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Rahul. Thank you, Tong.